Today's conference is presented to us as an opportunity to reflect on the Levant not as a war-torn region of the world, but as a trope or an idea that ought to take advantage of a successful formula it once employed and which enabled nearly 400 years of peace and prosperity. The hope, simply put, is to create a new union of sorts, perhaps not of nation states, lest we forget how that panned out since the two world wars, but most likely a union of what once a network of related cities, the lingua franca of which was French, as you just heard, when their context was Ottoman. Hence, what some might see as an advantageous form of natural cosmopolitanism, and what others today welcome as a much desired form of diversity. Regardless, this morning's panel, us, is about banking on the Levantine city as the site of a memorable past, a difficult present, and hopefully a better future. Our task is to begin a conversation on the role that architecture, urbanism, and culture can play in the construction of a possible new Levant, while cautiously keeping in mind that the buildings we live in are often co-opted by unintended and unwanted politics, and they have all too often ended up as sites of urban warfare. If the Levant, however, was ever a successful modern enterprise, it was precisely because it wasn't nationalist and because it made little effort to brand itself consistently across its territory. What made Levantine cities modern is their very diversity, along with a taste for mid-19th century urban interventions that necessarily involved representative forms of municipal organization keen on investing in the public sphere, be it in the form of new boulevards, corniches, racetracks, public gardens, museums, infrastructural services, cafes, etc., to which one might add red light districts and the olfactory background of orange blossoms and Arabian jasmine. It is about that Levantine city that I will be asking questions to our panelists this morning. So in case you don't know, maybe written up there, I don't know, but I am Faris Dahdah, Professor of the Humanities and Director of the Humanities Research Center at Rice University, and I have been given the most welcome task of moderating a conversation between three university deans who happen to be leading three important schools of architecture in the US, and who, like me, happen to all be of Levantine heritage. I should also add that the four of us know each other and have intertwining career trajectories. Hashim and Rodolphe began their undergraduate education at the American University of Beirut and then transferred to the Rhode Island School of Design, where I too went to school. Hashim and I went on to study at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design, and so did Amal, after getting her undergraduate degree from McGill University. Rodolphe went his separate way and got his master's degree from MIT and doctorate from Princeton. Hashim and I got ours from Harvard, where Hashim stayed and joined the faculty, and so did Rodolphe. Amal and I also taught there as visiting professors. So Rodolphe el-Khoury went on to join the faculty at the University of Toronto before becoming Dean of the School of Architecture at the University of Miami. Amal Andraos joined the faculty at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, where she became the Dean. And Hashim left Harvard to become the Dean of the School of Architecture and Planning at MIT. I should also add that the last time the four of us were together was coincidentally here in DC, and at the time we did contemplate how we as a group were in a position to do something, academically speaking, about the region. So here we are again, and for this morning's discussion, perhaps we should begin by addressing head-on the irony of us four having been invited to talk about a vibrant history of Levantine coexistence at a moment when Iraq continues to be stricken with vicious rounds of sectarian violence, when Syria is going through a debilitating civil war, and when Lebanon seems to perpetually be on the brink of sectarian implosion. Like it or not, there is a pervasive belief that sectarianism is, and that perhaps it has always been, a self-evident feature of the region. While this is becoming increasingly difficult to refute, all of us in this hall probably keep wondering about the point of exhaustion that the region is bound to reach, and that there may still be room to push back against Orientalist narratives that keep obscuring the degree to which coexistence is indeed a lived experience and a cultural norm that has long defined the Levant. After all, our grandparents did live in an ecumenical society where Muslims, Christians, and Jews worked together to produce a modern consciousness and a secular public sphere. My grandparents, those of Hashim's, Amal's, Hodol's, were just as engaged with technological innovation and modern science as other grandparents were elsewhere in the world. Granted, their politics were not always democratic, and they often overlooked the fact that their view of coexistence was antithetical to a colonial model of pluralism in which Western powers made themselves indispensable arbiters among local communities that were all too conveniently deemed hostile. It remains nonetheless evident that the Levant did cultivate a modern idea of coexistence, be it Pan-Arabist or Near Eastern, and that it can not only be seen as having once fostered a resistance movement against an Ottoman imperial regime riddled with discrimination, but can also become one once again. So, after this long introduction, I now propose that we address the topic of the Levantine city by looking at it temporally and by foreseeing that if cities like Homs, Aleppo, Mosul, and Raqqa will rebuild, how can we make sure that they will recover the diversity they once had? And can we imagine cities in a new Levant that are compatible with the disparate, if not conflicting, values of diversity, secular nationalism, multi-confessionalism, pluralism, cohesiveness, equality, and compatriotship? So I'll start with you, Hashim. You recently designed the municipality of Byblos, one of the oldest cities in the Levant, and you have written about how a city like Beirut faced the issue of its post-war reconstruction. In your research, you have also focused on the geographies between cities. If it were up to you, what lessons in post-war organization can possibly serve a hopeful future for once vibrant cities destroyed by war? In other words, what are these urban ingredients out of which Beirut or Aleppo are made, and what are the networks on which they depend? And what should we do to both preserve these ingredients and these networks in the hope of seeing them redeployed again?
Throughout the years I've known Faris, he's always had difficult questions. So he hasn't changed, I can tell you that. Good morning. Thanks for bringing us here, bringing us together. And thanks for the new Levantine initiative for answering the question that we raised as a group last time: what can we do together? I think this bodes very well for us, and the discussions that led us here are already full of ideas. The politics of the region have divided us. And I truly believe that geography will bring us back together. By geography, I mean mountains, rivers, valleys, but I also mean culture, I also mean connectedness, and I mean the history of that geography, which actually shaped the region very beautifully. There were hinterlands that were reaching to the sea in order to find outlets that connected with each other in networks of trade and commerce. And there were distant shores with frequency of interaction between them. But there were also mountains that guarded from a farther away hinterland, and in all of these geographic formations helped form the urbanization of the region historically. For some reason, we have abandoned that geography. And yet, that geography with the growing cities has come back to inform how cities could grow, and it could do that more. So I strongly believe that the interregional geographies could play a very important role in shaping the growth of cities, but they can also play an important role in re-establishing connections that politics have separated. I'll just give you two examples. One is a study that I've been doing with a group of students at MIT on larger regional formations in the Levant area. As we're studying the growth of cities like Aleppo, like Damascus, and others, we noticed that as they grow beyond the metropolitan level, they start shrapneling around smaller centers and along paths that are not recognizable as being roads. Well, it turns out that those small nuclei are the tell formations, and those paths were actually the old trade routes. And so that geography is informing, and you look at it and it looks graphically like a fertile crescent. Coastal areas are also growing in a very different formation in a way that now again challenges the metropolitan scale. They're connecting with each other in the form of a ladder, a coastal road and a hinterland road. That's the history of the region, the coast and the hinterland. But also creating T formations of routes up into the mountains, which are now beginning to create a third line of connectedness. And all of that is informed by geography. We should enhance that. We should make our mountains more visible. We should make our valleys more present in the connectedness among cities. And for anyone who looks at a Google Earth map, you can see very graphically how corridors like the ones that existed from Sidon all the way down to the Jordan Valley, or between Aleppo and Iskandarun, are still there, even though politics have divided them. We can bring them back. That's at one scale. I would like to answer the question at two other scales, the scale of cities and the life in cities, and the scale of architecture. One thing that Levantine cities have is a pulse, a very particular pulse. And by that I mean the frequency of doors on a street, the way in which inside one building, one hara, one dar, there's a certain mixing of uses, but also mixing of income groups. If you look at the apartment buildings of Beirut before the war, you would have a grocer, a coiffeur, a car dealer, on the second floor, a lawyer, a doctor, a dentist, and then a few apartments, and on the roofs, very illicit activities can happen. The Polykatekia in Athens is the same. The apartment buildings of Izmir had that same pulse. When Beirut tried to rebuild its downtown, they rebuilt the facades, but they forgot about that pulse. They kept one door on the street open and blocked the other six. They turned the whole building into one use, dull office spaces or dull apartment buildings. I think holding on to that mix, especially at a time when the whole world is beginning to look at the land use mixture, is very, very important. At the scale of architecture, we were discussing yesterday with Mr. Daniel about the fact that the region is characterized by a rich private sector and a rather poor public sector, but that it has always been organized and its affinities have always been shaped around groups in civil society, some secular, some sectarian, that helped give a different fabric to the cities. And they introduced institutions in the form of public monuments that shaped the neighborhoods and the smaller cities and all. Coming back to the municipality of Byblos, when we were working on that project, we thought that a recovery of a modest monumentality at the scale of the smaller cities allows these cities, neighborhoods, to have a new dignity, a new form of empowerment through architecture that gives them visibility and presence after the hegemony of the nation states and after the hegemony of the larger capital cities. So I truly believe that there's a possibility of coupling a re-emergence of civil society with a re-emergence of a different kind of architecture that has always been there, but we can recover as well now.
I'm going to come back to the idea that these pulses, these rhythms can be somehow recaptured or somehow made visible. And this could very well be part of an effort that we could do to do precisely that. But before I get there, I'm going to ask Amal first. So Amal, you've organized a conference on and written about the Arab city and are well aware of a surprisingly hopeful new generation of architects, scholars and scholarly virtual networks, preservation initiatives, who, in your own words, remain irreverently optimistic about the power of a secular, transnational, progressive, and intellectual Arab world. For the sake of our audience, would you be able to describe how the work that this generation is undertaking fits in the panorama of a new Levantine city, and how could that be instrumentalized going forward?
So I think that you could say that architects embody what Gramsci has said, we should all embrace, which is the pessimism of the mind, but the optimism of the will. I think we're just eternal optimists despite everything. And when I became dean at Columbia GSAP, I wanted to try to invite this, new generation to think about this question of the Arab city, because we are at a moment now, as you said, of continued destruction. But at the same time, we need to project new futures. We need to continue to think about how we can assemble ourselves in new ways. And so, history, as this conference, I think, is trying to suggest, is a way to find alternate modes to understand who we are and how we can exist together and the kinds of environments we can construct. And I love what Hashim has said. It's really about thinking across scales, from the scale of the building, the municipality, but entire regions. And in the age of climate change, we have to think constantly about these questions. So for example, I'll give you an example. In my own work, part of the conference, we had looked at the Art Deco buildings in Beirut. And it's a very interesting period. It's just 10 years, just before modernism kicks in the kind of 40s. And it is completely modern. I mean, it's the engagement with, modernist ideas. It's the Corbusian concrete frame, slabs, columns, and then there's this thickened envelope, the kind of famous balcony, the verandas, which are negotiating inside and outside, which are negotiating the private and the public, and are all about this kind of excessive pleasure. And it's a sort of the inspirations are coming from Italy, they're coming from Greece, they're coming from trade catalogs. Concrete has just arrived, and now everybody can pretend like they have their buildings made out of marbles. And that kind of hybridity of a Lebanese central plan mixed with hybrid references on the facade, mixed with this kind of sense of Mediterranean experience, that is kind of this diverse modernity that I think we're trying to speak about. And even if you think about modernism, which I think in the West is always represented as a kind of imposition, I think your book, Hashem, on the reconstruction of Beirut really shows that modernism was embraced and hybridized in the Middle East, where it wasn't such a kind of cold, a lot of the kind of local traditions and climactic concerns, came into being. Then you think about what happened in Baghdad in the 50s with this kind of renaissance that was all about creating a new language for architecture. And the references were not, Islamic or, I invited an architect who is now probably in his late 80s, Hisham Munir, who had worked with famous, architects such as Shadirji and Makiya, and there's an incredible literature scene, art scene, and they're thinking about Babylonian heritage and Sumerian, and they're just kind of hybridizing all of that and creating a new language which is not postmodern, which is really very anchored in place, but also incredibly cosmopolitan. You think about Cairo and the emergence of the professional engineering class under Nasser, with many women who were leading incredible projects, housing projects, infrastructural projects. So that engagement with modernity was so kind of spread. And it's very interesting to see a kind of break, which is what I looked at and what we looked at as part of the conference, which is when the oil economies start to rise in Saudi Arabia, and I grew up in Saudi, so I sort of am very familiar, you know, these more conservative societies start to look at expressions of religious identity and a certain Orientalism in the architecture. They turn to the Japanese, who the Japanese as architects were very, you know, have a kind of very strong legacy of building nationalism through the architecture, and very interesting. So people like Tange come in. Yamazaki builds this beautiful airport in Dahran, but it's orientalized. It's very, it's kind of bringing. It's a different engagement with the modern project, and these questions of kind of religious identities become stronger, I think, expressed in the architecture and the urbanism. Even cities like Khobar, which were designed by Candilis Joseph Woods, who were kind of second-generation modernists, are very modernist in plan, but in elevation, the walls are up, right? Because you can't, you need privacy, and you need, so it's kind of modernist in plan and very kind of traditional, or at least conservative in section. And I think today, and the reason for the conference was that today, if you look at the last 10, 15 years in the Gulf cities, you know, a lot of the architects, kind of global architects, you know, are I think producing these kinds, and even downtown Beirut, producing more reductive meanings of identity. You know, suddenly we have references to Mushabiyas and the oasis and the desert, and so that richness, which I think concepts such as the Levantine can suggest, and that history, and or a more contemporary history of really a shift, you know, a struggle for power, you know, from the old cities to the new cities, from the cities such as Beirut, Baghdad, Damascus to Dubai. I mean, it's a real transfer of geopolitical sort of power. I think that you can express those tensions within a knowledge that's kind of has a deeper history to get out of these reductive identities, which I think, you know, we're kind of hungry for, to bring back this this cosmopolitanism, this space for diversity. I think the problem with identity is that it's often constructed at the exclusion of another, and yet these cities, when they're dense and they're striving, they can demonstrate how actually it's the opposite, that it's within that ecology that incredible cultures and economies can exist. So these are some of the thoughts that were brought up in the conference, and that I think we've been talking, you know, for some time about how, you know, how is it possible that in an academic context where we're sort of both engaged and removed, we can, you know, dive back or make visible what is happening today, what happened in the past, to find new ways to move forward. I think geography is one. I think the question of scale, at what scale can we produce change, is another question. The question of housing is really interesting in the region, to think about the house and housing, and today, you know, questions of migration have a certain urgency, and so there's a lot that one can do through sort of looking both at architecture as culture, but also at architecture as the planning of cities, and find within that expression and those forms of intervention, I think, ways to get out of where we are and construct something new.
It always strikes me that in the construction of any identity, be it Levantine, be it how Brazil invented itself, the ingredients tend to be rather simple. It's an investment in history and geography. As in Arabic, we'd say تاريخ وجغرافيا, which are the staples of any education. So we've gone through geographical constructions, cultural heritage, and the preservation of a history that dissipates quite easily. I'm going to ask my third question to Rodolphe, who early in April is organizing a conference of his own titled Smart Cities, Miami 2018, where leaders in academia, professional practice and industry will examine how computational resources and analytical expertise can aid in the design and development of more sustainable, livable, and resilient cities. Now that we, not that we haven't tried banking on technology before and miserably failed, but now that technology is presumably smarter, to what degree might coding become the lingua franca of a new Levant, as networked of a place as it once was not that long ago?
Thank you for that question. You knew I'm gonna come here and talk about technology, so I got the softball. Well, you guys have the difficult, nuanced,
The hard one.
Yes. So yes, of course, I am here to make an argument for how technology actually may be one of the most efficient instruments that we would have in reshaping that region and constituting the network of the Levantine cities, as much as the shared heritage, the built environment, and the geography. I think that with technology, there's a great potential, especially when we think about leapfrogging technologies. And what brings those cities together may be actually their capacity, the conditions that they have that actually would foster a culture of entrepreneurship and innovation that would unleash technology in very powerful ways and assist maybe from the ground up in establishing that economic integration as much as or in tandem with the governmental policies and the established financial institutions. So what are those conditions? How actually can we foster this culture? What are the resources needed? These are the questions that preoccupy us at the School of Architecture at the University of Miami, for instance, and especially actually in the developing world. For instance, we have a team working with the University Center for Computational Science that is actually using drones with a proprietary computer vision technology that is very cost effective. They're using those drones to map very precisely down to the centimeter the informal settlements in Latin America. So to produce very precise, elaborate, complete 3D digital models. And that is coupled with data that is crowdsourced on the ground to constitute very rich databases that are open source, available to become resources for civic hackers, entrepreneurs who will complement in very important ways the services that are offered by the municipality, but also they are a very important resource for the residents in their legal claim for ownership. And that's really the first step in establishing equity that will lift them from poverty. So these are examples, but I'm going to indulge in a few more. Like I lead a research lab at the university that is dedicated to the Internet of Things, to the prototyping of a world where everything is connected, where we have the capacity actually to capitalize on big data to make better decisions and to offer all kinds of services. So, and we do all kinds of things from, imagine equipping a blanket with sensors deployed as a kind of a decorative pattern. So the electronic circuit is
embroidery.
Yes, exactly. To monitor sleep disorders, to this project we developed for a Miami neighborhood, the design district. It's a shading strategy for the district. We have drones equipped with inflatable parasols that actually will follow you around. There are all kinds of uses for drones. Invest in drones. And of course, smart cities. We were very excited to get a commission actually from the Yucatan province, from a group of private developers to design a smart city from the ground up, and it was great. We are still working on this. We have developed all kinds of smart services, but most importantly, we have elaborated this very interesting digital platform for the city that basically allows citizens to manage and control their relationship to those smart services, from customizing some of the features of the city, just like you would customize with profile settings a piece of hardware or software. You can even decide what kind of public lighting you would like, or to also providing mechanisms for mass participatory governance with interfaces for decision making, voting, etc. But also, this platform is equipped with tools and databases that are available for user-built add-ons, basically, that actually then flesh out all the possible services provided by the platform. And that's the exciting part. So we had tested this with our students in the course that I taught to see what they can come up with the available data and resources. And one team had a very interesting idea, which I'm going to share with you. The city had a very ambitious, beautiful system of open space, a park that actually connected all the corners of the city in a very extensive network of open spaces. Well, that wasn't realized because of, you can imagine why, market forces, etc. So we lost the park in favor of larger individual parcels. So we ended up with the same ratio of open space to build surface, but the open space were backyards. So the team of students imagined something very interesting. They reconstituted those backyards as micro farms, productive gardens, and used the power of that digital platform to organize very complicated citywide logistics to create a unified system from the aggregation and the collection of each individual parcels, complete, with all the benefits that you would get from the the large-scale economies. They had even a trading system, even a local kind of cryptocurrency, a system of points that enable transactions at no cost. Anyway, they developed a unified, coherent, large-scale, citywide system by aggregating all of these individual pieces and by means of the technology. So I wanted to share with you this example because it illustrates how, for instance, when we fail with planning, top-down planning, with a vision of this grand park, actually somebody else succeeded with individual entrepreneurial initiatives.
To what degree can this be applied to a refugee camp, let's say?
No, that's exactly where it can apply. For instance, and I shared with this with you yesterday, there's a discussion about how blockchain technology has been used, for instance, in refugee camps for the distribution of food and resources. It is actually precisely where the more established financial institutions and regulatory processes are absent, where we are more likely to adopt more radical and innovative solutions. I think this is why I'm excited about the possibility of these emergent technology in creating business opportunities and unified networks in the region. But we have to think about, we have to help them by creating the conditions that facilitate those innovations.
We are, in universities, we are producers of knowledge, we teach. The material that we need to look at is often inaccessible, is often difficult to find, and our relationship with local academic institutions is close to nil. So now, in that context, and since, the three of you are deans of architecture in major US universities, what could we do in our own context, at our own universities, to facilitate these kinds of projects, be it projects that leapfrog using arrays of nano satellites or something like this to provide Wi-Fi where you couldn't possibly have Wi-Fi, or what at MIT could be done or what at Columbia could be done. We have 6 minutes and 41 seconds left. I'll let you take that one. You want to talk? Go.
I would like us to establish Levant labs across the universities with labs also in the region, where the role of the institutions in the region is not to be the receivers of our ideas, but to the contrary, to help us learn more, to help us find solutions that the world has somehow ignored. The question of blockchain use of technology in refugee camps is a fantastic, brilliant solution. That will borrow from Amal, show a certain optimism about the region rather than constantly think about it as being the source of problems. It will be the source of solutions. If we are able to think about the themes that we've already talked about, there's a lot of ideas that cross between us and link to the region. And then there are a lot of areas of expertise that we can bank on to complement each other. I just want to make a comment about what Amal said and what Rudolf said, just to show that complementarity. Amal was talking about the fact that certain cultural identities are imposed on us. And that moment that you pulled out from the 1920s, 30s, before the emergence of nation states, before the imposition of one identity per country, is a moment where these identities through architecture were being negotiated. An idea from here, an idea from there, and we make a building. Culture always presents itself as being static. That's one of its biggest powers, to disguise the fact that it's actually fluid. And identity always presents itself as also being singular rather than negotiated. I think the Levantine culture and the Levantine identity have always been open about the negotiability of identity and the interchange and fluidity of cultures. We need to push that. And I think in relationship to geography, geography should not be understood to be static, but also to be fluid and transformative. And in relation to technology, I feel also there's a complementarity between thinking about a newly emerging civil society that wants to build its houses in a negotiated way, and the technologies that are empowering that civil society. And so I can see a lot of overlap between our projects already, having talked about them just last night and today.
No, exactly. I think that I was thinking when you were speaking about the notion of static identities, and of course Edward Said, who wrote Orientalism at Columbia University to demonstrate that there's nothing static about an identity, whether geographically or in time. What's interesting about architecture and cities and environments is that they can keep contradictions together. They can keep ideas that we construct as opposite together. There, you see it. You see a column that's this way and an opening that's that way, and they work and they're beautiful. And so I think that it's a project it's a kind of two lines. One is a project to re-represent the region to itself, to dive back into history, to find these moments, to make them accessible, to make them visible, to tell new stories, different stories, alternate stories for a new generation to say, hey, this happened this way, not the way I thought it, And so history has a really important role. And on the other hand, to empower people outside, inside, to find new ways to do things, whether it's through technology, whether it's through sort of supporting ways to develop affordable housing, through knowledge about financing, through sort of thinking about the formal and the informal in planning. I mean, it's both kind of a sort of practical knowledge support system, which would be open source, and also a much broader sort of cultural project that is about defining, telling new stories that people can, sort of enable people to imagine something different.
But I'm not sure, I mean, that it's so much about defining the identity or dwelling again on the identity as much as actually producing the conditions that from which those identities have emerged, and namely the free flow of ideas and information. Those are the conditions for business to flourish, the integration that will facilitate the transactions, the ideas, and the business.
But it's culture also.
Right.
I think, it's both,
Right.
the business side and the cultural side, and sort of
cultural mobility defines the very Levant and defines us. I mean, look at us.
We are mobile.
We've navigated through.
I'm always in a Beirut state of mind. Wherever
Yes,
I am,
absolutely.
I carry it with me. Well, I wanted to add to this, maybe one thing that has always been regarded in a pejorative way about the Levantine identity culture is its mercantilism. Tajir, samsar, all of these attributes are seen in the negative. I think we should begin to look at them in the positive. Merchants never build walls. Merchants never wage wars. Merchants are open to exchanges and dialogue and negotiation. I think that attribute brought into culture will go a long way. And I think that's what we're calling for.
Right.
So, thank you, Hashim. That's a perfect note to end on. We have 40 seconds left. Thank you very much. And thank you for bringing us together.